I wondered if anyone had been able to get to John Roberts' talk. I think it was on Thursday on the Avant-Garde. It was in visual culture. Did anyone get to that? He was talking about the Avant-Garde, but from an immanent perspective, and gave very, actually completely resisted giving any examples that might support some of the theses he was making, or potentially undermine it. And this talk is also on the avant-garde, but it's going to give a lot of examples, because well, I talk about Hegel. I'm not a Hegelian, as John said he was. I'm interested in some way, always at verifying what I'm claiming in these talks and thoughts. So, by 1989, following the selling of her entire show at the Cologne Gallery, New Jersey artist Laurie Parsons asked her dealers to no longer offer anything of hers for sale. That sellout show in Germany, is that too bright on the screen? Can you see it all right? That sellout show in Germany comprised unaltered debris like rope, wood, and charcoal that Parsons had collected from Hoboken streets. And in the inset there at the top, you can see the Rolf Ricker show in Germany that had sold out. There's very little of her work online, as you'll find out why. But this didn't deter Lawrence Monk, and her refusing to allow anything to be sold didn't deter Lawrence Monk from offering her solo exhibition the following year, for which she simply repainted the gallery, but left her name and the dates of the show off the invitation. A bit later, she also stopped listing this exhibition on her CV. And that was pretty much the extent of my encounter with Parsons' work in New York. One of the interventions she did at this time that foretold where she was heading was to spend 7 weeks sleeping in a gallery in the German town Rottweil, going out each day to work in a hospital and a school for disabled children. She would leave the gallery door unlocked at night, as well as during the day, and agree to talk to anyone who came by. The end of this quasi-show was marked by a party which most of the town attended. In 1992, at the New Museum, located then on Broadway, she placed a pile of $300 $1 bills on the floor with instructions to the guards not to stop people taking them, which of course happened fairly quickly. By 1994, she was declining all invitations to exhibit. After speaking with a man she had often seen on the streets of Hoboken, sleeping in a tent, Parsons spent a great deal of time helping him find a subsidized apartment and ending his 10 years of homelessness. Since then, she has been involved with social work in psychiatric hospitals. She showed no interest in reading the Bob Nickers Hard Forum article, where I found this information, telling him to make up anything that he didn't understand. Evidently, she no longer tells people that she was once an artist. Parsons was one of a small number of American artists active in the early 1990s that attracted the label slacker as a way of describing their ambivalent commitment to prevailing standards of studio production, work ethic, and the marketplace. It's a bit rash of me to suggest to a cohort of MA students that I'm teaching that dropping out of all participation with art institutions is a viable solution to the confusion and alienation we often face in locating a viable place for ourselves in contemporary art milieux. We'd really like you to stay here longer. Nevertheless, perhaps Parsons' decision to disappear can stand there for us as a reality check when times get hard, in the way we may routinely engage with notions of critique or positions. I don't think Parsons' progressive steps towards the exit sign can be convincingly defined as ethical, political, or ascetic in terms of self-abnegating withdrawal, nor as aesthetic for that matter. Perhaps they are simply more of a practical nature, as in, this just feels a better way to live my life, so I'll go there. She described Her procedure of retrieving and showing unaltered material as acknowledging a presence in objects she felt were as powerful as artworks. If Parsons found the world to be sufficient, then it's understandable that she might move towards an orientation that left the world where it was to start with, and to no longer displace it by moving it to galleries. Parsons may have felt that the initial experimental displacement from street to gallery didn't harm the quality she perceived in the found objects. However, once they were uprooted a second time through their sale, the transmutation into art became irreversible. The commodification of material was by then complete, and at that point she evidently became distressed and forbade the sale of any more of her work. Christian Oppenheim is a sound artist with a strong record of exhibitions in London, Paris, and New York. Even though she sings her minimally designed soundtracks but broadcast in the gallery, her work is somewhat withdrawn and non-declaratory, and she will be having a show at Greengrassy next year, if you want to check up on that. Emerging at the time of other slacker artists, it's as if she found a working place in the shadows with which she felt most comfortable. It's a different story, though, with her brother Eric Oppenheim, who also started to exhibit in New York in the early 1990s, but who withdrew completely from the art world shortly afterwards. The withdrawal of the siblings may partly be due to the overwhelming subjectivity of their artist father, Dennis Oppenheim, celebrated as a key post-minimal conceptual and performance artist. And I mean, there's no images that exist of Eric's work, as far as I can see, that I've been able to find. And if you photograph Christians, it's simply two speakers in the gallery, so I haven't shown you that. So, nonetheless, I saw memorable shows by both siblings when I was in New York that suggested the start of very successful careers. Without warning the artist beforehand for a curated show he organized, Eric Oppenheim concealed all of the artist's work behind a wall into which he inset 35mm slides of each piece. Some artists were furious at the opening and pulled their work from the show, while others recognized the quality of the concept and stayed. Later, in a one-person show consisting of purchasable actions, he offered to be a dinner guest or to demolish a wall in your apartment. I mean, that's not either or. Like, if you don't take me out for dinner, I'll demolish a wall. These are two of a series of proposals. And now he's committed to fostering a young neighborhood child in Brooklyn. And although he continues to make work, he refuses absolutely to exhibit it. I want to ask here if slacker artists like Laurie Parsons or Eric Oppenheim can be spoken about in any way as a legacy of the history of avant-gardism, or as something entirely awry, off base, on another economic model, unrecognizable, useless even for the financial media of contemporary art speculation. If not avant-garde artists themselves, then perhaps they develop unconventional tactics in the face of predicaments encountered by earlier avant-gardists. This is one way of imagining the history of the contemporary as a string of connected tactical moments determined by avant-garde tropes of action and recuperation. Do artists such as Parsons and Oppenheim resign themselves to a frame of mind and a visual language that deal with the sense of exhaustion experienced at the end of avant-gardism? Or do they continue a different tradition, inverted commas, one of less critical or economic value, involved in non-participation, but most importantly, also attached to enthusiasms and intoxications that the contemporary art of phantasmagoria or spectacle can't use. With its familiar dichotomies of subversion and recuperation, the avant-garde has been the dominant interpretive model for understanding how the old is succeeded by the new. And it's a model I'm happy to work with, as it provides some tools for trying to figure out what has happened to art over the last 200 years. But who does this model serve, if not the institutions that supposedly are transformed by avant-garde activism? I want to ask if the centuries-old labyrinth into which we've been born and keep trying to exit, a labyrinth of aesthetic subversions and aggressions, of retreats into obstructive nonsense or formless renunciations, starts with the original slacker Baudelaire and his furious poems from Flowers of Evil and Paris Spleen in the 1860s, or with Hegel's observations in his 1831 Aesthetics about the decline of art's importance. Or does it originate even earlier with Diderot's 1760s narrative, Rameau's Nephew, that strange story about alienation, wild musical improvisation, and slacker attitude? In one of the more thorough analyses, Peter Berger defines the avant-garde as those practices that sublate art into life. In other words, that dissolve traditional art forms where artists can newly engage art practice with life. That social practices or relational aesthetics work in displaying themselves and getting themselves out there through community commissions, biennales, residencies, and other employments, such as installations in collectors' houses, participating in redefining the boundaries of art rather than becoming absorbed into life, and thus no longer being art, suggests that the art, if anything, reinforces its discreteness and its separation from life. There may then be something wrong with this transformation model, rather than with the artist. And yet Berger explains that it's because 19th century art became completely detached from having any impact on life, that artists tried to undermine the limiting structural definitions and roles of art as a way to re-engage their own practices. As Berger explains, the European avant-gardes, quoting that, European avant-garde movement can be defined as an attack on the status of art in bourgeois society. What is negated is not an earlier form of art, a style, but art as an institution that is unassociated with the life practices of men. For Berger, this notion of the institution of art refers to a process by which artwork is neutralized through being fixed as an accessory that reflects and enhances the values of bourgeois individual life, rather than being able to engage with community experience, as was the case with early art. And in terms of early art, in his argument, he talks about sacred and courtly art. And I think it's quite a good illustration of the participation of the community in sacred art that he would have in mind would be the movement of Duccio's Maestro, this huge altarpiece from the studio where Duccio made it to the cathedral in Siena. As it was moved through the streets, this parade accumulated followers. People absorbed, enthusiastic for this piece that had been made for their town. Berger is saying this ceases to happen in the 19th century. In the period where the avant-garde emerges, which I would say we can discern in the early 19th century, we can see the crisis caused by this limited role in some 19th century paintings, like Meissonier's Barricade and Géricault's Medusa, rather than Medusa, which exceptionally depict a traumatic underside to the emerging prosperity of the time. And in the case of these, and this is very well known, of course, these both are explicit criticisms of authority structures. In the case of the Medusa, of official incompetence in the rescue effort for the stranded ship. And here at Barricade, Meissonier saw these men being killed, being thrown from windows or being bayoneted or shot after the barricade was taken by national troops. Works like these complicate Berger's formula, for they show that ruptures were possible in the role assigned to art in this period, at least in terms of its content. That Berger's answer to these examples is to explain that art whose imagery or language, like this, protests existing conditions, is only going to get caught in what Marcuse have called the affirmative character of art, where society is relieved of doing anything about those conditions by seeing their resolution fictionalized or depicted in art. The only viable exit, he proposes, is for radical artists to undermine these limitations on function and agency by challenging the way in which society defines what an artwork can be. In this interpretation, of course, Duchamp becomes the model for Berger's definition of the attack on the institution of art, where the expectation of art to be the production of a creative, gifted, and skilled individual is completely annihilated, at least symbolically, if not actually, as the signed but mass-produced urinal displaces the value typically residing in signature works of art. Just a bit of water.
Well, maybe turn the lights at the front down a bit.
Yeah, that's as long as I can see to read. I don't see. I'm going down. I use my iPhone, I suppose, is that? Let's see.
Maybe not, sorry.
We'll work on getting a portable light. There's a lot of slides, so it's a good idea. That's great. Well, the battery lasts. Those of you familiar with this theory of Berger's will know what comes next. The first gesture, a radical anti-institutional practice, temporarily stuns the institution, but then, on being repeated, it becomes absorbed into what it once opposed. Repeated subversiveness constitutes the neo-avant-garde, his term, which recycles gestures of radicality but changes nothing. Berger's neo-avant-garde is taken up by Hal Foster much later in a critical way to defend artists like Hans Hacker and Andrea Fraser that he supports and who are involved in institutional critique. Although I suppose we might be able to see psycho artists as challenging institutional expectations of work ethic, quality of materials, content, and so on, this is not really the ground on which I choose to defend their radicality, such as it is. We should not, after all, be surprised to find that psycho tactics extend to the ethics themselves that are associated with radical or engaged practices. I would be interested, though, to consider whether Laurie Parsons and Eric Oppenheim found a way to sublate their work into the practice of life through withdrawal, through a version of psychodom that continues well past the exit. One of the problems with a theory of the avant-garde like Berger's, however compellingly articulated, and it's a book I really like, and I really recommend an engagement with it if you're interested in this at all. One of the problems is the rigidity of its architecture that oversimplifies the breadth of what's being made and felt in any historical period, that doesn't tolerate weirdness, unpredictability, and left turns into culture and scrutiny. You can see that now. Think of Granby or Marion here, for example, whom Walter Benjamin found such compelling examples of 19th century aberrant but insightful practice. And what about craft, folk music, cooking, or walking, the flaneur, for example, that cannot be completely subsumed under the schema of a world enthralled to commerce? In de Soto's analysis in the practice of everyday life, such activities of ordinary people would be shown through their idiosyncrasies and their contrast with institutional practices to inherently possess agency. Berger's acclaim for militant or anti-institutional avant-garde work underestimates the preparedness of sectors of Western capitalist societies to absorb cultural shocks, to know that they are in touch with the most challenging ideas of the present, and to be seen to be capable of understanding and embracing threats. It underestimates the fundamental economic need for business to be connected to radical thinking in order to innovate and remain competitive. In respect of its antagonism, the avant-garde has been the cultural advance of the middle class and not its aggressor. It has provided the social gratification of contemporaneity and the reassurance of being a creative class. In our own context, this has occurred with those YBAs, for example, participating in Damien Hirst Free's exhibition, prior to their canonization as the homegrown, radical alternative. The idea of an avant-garde posing a serious threat to middle-class prominence is largely fictional. Paul Mann, in The Theory Death of the Avant-Garde, which is the book that preceded the one that, from which the chapter Stupid Undergrounds came, Paul Mann explains how the radicality of late 19th century Impressionists, for example, was immediately understood by the French bourgeoisie as offering a much-needed transformation of a moribund culture as a type of art that displaced the darkness of academic painting with the light-filled scenes of modern industrialized and leisure-filled life. The Impressionist salon de refusé can then be seen not as a cultural exile, but as a temporary alternative, a necessary rupture with the academy to reboot an entrenched conservative institution. We can see the same process of near-instant recuperation of aesthetic radicalism occurring with Dada, Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, Fluxus, institutional critique, social practices, once each phenomenon has been provisionally situated outside the mainstream. We should then ask if there is some property of these entities, some remainder, that exceeds the process of absorption, if only for a few moments. Is it reasonable to want to identify a thrill, exhilaration, even intense pleasure, with a startled recognition of an event, an eruption, in the production of the work, and in one's own participation as a spectator, that for the sake of a better word we would call intoxication? Perhaps it doesn't count for much in the stakes of criticality. Maybe that's, I'll still have some battery. So perhaps it doesn't count for much in the stakes of criticality. But where we are trying in our work not to be subsumed by market forces or the strictures of a profession, in this case, a profession of artist, the uncontrollable thrill of pleasure that escapes surveillance in our practice may be all that signals to us that we still have something uncolonized. And here's the book from which that chapter comes. Paul Mann touches on this in the Stupid Undergrounds chapter that I suggested as reading. Stupid fun, he writes, is quite serious. It is also political. And this is always with them tongue-in-cheek. It's also political, we are told, by being a subversion of the serious, the practical, the useful, the profitable. But it also flows free of the objects to which capital would like to have fixed it. This relates to what Mann elsewhere describes as the point of putting up with the stupid underground, to pursue a renunciation of culture past the limit, where it precisely leaves us behind, where criticism can no longer observe it, no longer recuperate it. Something Berger says about Dada and surrealist automatic writing is promising for our discussion. The instructions issued by Zara and Breton on how to write poetry, he says, are like recipes, and therefore can be taken up by anyone. Automatic writing and the transcription of dreams have no required skill, and therefore invite a change to the technologies of writing. Overnight, quite literally, dreams, as recipient becomes producer, the categories of production and consumption of culture dissolve. About which Breton wrote, surrealism's distinctive feature is to have proclaimed the total equality of all normal human beings before the subliminal message. It's worth looking at Jim Shaw's dream drawings, which in their unskilled and psycho-like graphic style and matter-of-fact narrating are a contemporary model for Breton and Zara's flattening of hierarchies of production and reception. Is there a similar threshold with Parsons' work? I should say that these drawings fill entire books, galleries, and they are always accompanied by a written text describing the dream and the visualization of the dream. I think usually they're one above the other if they're exhibited in the book, they're side by side. So is there a similar threshold with Parsons' work? If her found materials could be retrieved and left unaltered by anyone, then is Parsons any more entitled to exhibit them than the next person? Something might be made of a process of selection being the differential between artist and non-artist, or the quality of a motivating concept or impulse. But the slacker makes a virtue of the failure to possess individual taste and skill, and the concepts of retrieving rubbish and drawing dreams are intentionally empty. Skilllessness and a refusal to select, to rule out criteria for inclusion, mark both Parsons and Shaw's work. I'm sure you all know examples amongst your own peer group, amongst the shows you're seeing or writing about, that update these kinds of responses towards the always troubled relationship between artist and marketplace. You are involved in far more that's new than I am at this moment. But how difficult this challenge remains seems well enough indicated by Jay-Z's Picasso Baby music performance made at New York's Pace Gallery. I'm assuming, do you know this piece? Okay, all right, good. I don't have to play it. The participation as audience performers by artists Marina Abramovich, Ngechi Mutu, Micheline Thomas, and Serrano, Lorna Simpson, Fred Wilson, Lawrence Weiner, each with their claims to radical and experimental initiatives, alongside gallerists and curators, reveals what sort of normalcy or imbrication in structures of power. Is it an appalling revelation of the extent to which our art world, someone's art world, has now completely turned on its back to have its tummy be tickled by wealth? Or is it a part of an adapting phantasmagoria, a spectacle which we ignore or dismiss at the risk of sealing our own irrelevance? In this sense, is it of no real concern, but just a passing entertainment amongst the hundreds of others that have become staples of an art world that is now a primary location of capitalist work? An art world where the criticism of a different Abramovich, Roman Abramovich, in one public venue, which Jeremy Della did at Venice Biennale, might only be promoting his eligibility for a position of power in another venue much closer to home, the new Serpentine Gallery, on which I think he and Mayor Bloomberg sit on the board. I'm afraid I don't have any good answers for this at all. We can often see this process of a technology being changed to open up the means of production to a larger constituency. Amongst many other social factors, the affordability of 7-inch vinyl records, the vinyl record production, and the development of new distribution systems like that started by Rock Trade made it possible for punk rock to thrive in the late 1970s. This series of autumn talks is about histories of the contemporary, so I'd like to be more explicit for a moment in responding to this. I have a friend who was sufficiently bothered by his experience of the contemporary to build and then self-publish a comprehensive archive. Mario Panchera's 45 Revolutions documents every punk symbol released in the UK between 1976 and 79, annotating them all equally with as much factual information as he could find. This is a flat history without selectivity or eulogy, and seems driven by esteem for the phenomenon of punk music as a complete assemblage. Of course, it's a collector's model, in that a collector must always be looking for completion if their practice is to stay meaningful. After going to hundreds of punk concerts in the late 70s, Panchera would drive around Britain, visiting every record and charity shop he could find, and buying all these rare records that at that time no one wanted. On the map he carried with him, he would cross off each town and village visited. Perhaps this is more of an anti-history though, for by allocating each record equal status in the archive, with image, track info, date, narrative, review selections, it allows the reader to evaluate whether the DIY band, for example, Desperate Bicycles, for example, may, after all, have had as much to offer as the Damned. Even if Johnny Rotten wrote for the NME, that the Bicycles' last single that, quote, the A side is average to dull, the B side is dull to below zero. Thank you. The book's alphabetical de-hierarchization of some 3,000 singles only reinforces how unencompassable and chaotic was this particular contemporaneity. Yet through the nuance of Panchera's tireless annotations, you do get a sense of what these musicians were thinking, what motivated them, what mattered to them. A history emerges from the proximity Panchera had to his material. Musicians now visit him to find out what they did and in what circumstances. So comprehensive is the historical material he has collected and laid out. Perhaps, so this isn't completely abstract, we should remind ourselves what some of this music sounded like. A good example is the Mekon's 1978 single, Never Been in a Riot. This first release of theirs is a striking example of DIY aesthetics, as the genre has recently been described. The shambolic mistakes that open the B-side, 32 Weeks, comprise a delightfully messy start to a song that cares little about conventional musicianship and whose sardonic advocacy of full participation in the consumer economy embodies a punk psycho orientation. Although in 1977 there can't have been much anticipation of Mekon's subsequent participation in socialist causes, the song's lyrics, the 32 Weeks, introduced a stroppy non-conformism that would develop into focused activist work against racism, against Thatcher, the miners' strike, death penalty, and some of the more powerful political songs of our time. In relation to avant-gardism, it's too simplistic to dismiss this as an example of Marcuse's affirmative culture, as a representation of social trauma that absolves its perpetrators from fixing them. The materiality of the songs, their acoustic force and lyrical sophistication show musicians constantly experimenting with the agency of music and its ability to write histories of its time. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but these punk examples remind me of Eric Auerbach's reflections in Mimesis of Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks. Mimesis was written in the 1940s in Istanbul, where Auerbach was a Holocaust refugee. It claims to be a history of how reality was depicted in Western literature, but in the course of its analysis becomes an intensely observed study of human behavior. Gregory, the subject, the author, was a Catholic bishop in the Merovingian period of 500 AD, one of the more brutal episodes of European history. Imagine altogether more pointlessly murderous and ungovernable clans than Game of Thrones, and you'll have some sense of the mayhem which Gregory narrated and negotiated as a cleric. In vivid and straightforward language, he wrote down what he saw and heard, usually unjudgmentally. His factual accumulation is of the same category as Panchera's. In both cases, they are the perfect people for the job, both of independent means, immersed in their time, prescient of what would matter in the future, and wanting to set it down as clearly as possible. Auerbach writes of Gregory that what he relates, I quote, what he relates is his own, what he relates is his own and his only world. He has no other, and he lives in it. Lusts and passions lose every concealing form. They show themselves in the raw and with palpable immediacy. This brutal life becomes a sensible object. To him who would describe it, it presents itself as devoid of order and difficult to order, but tangible, earthy, alive. Strikes me as not such a bad description of punk really as it's too. Even if better histories like these are ensured by the deepest involvement in one's subject, it's obvious the material circumstances that grant historians like Panchero and Gregory the time and means to write will likely be denied those they write about. Perhaps then historians need to be separated materially, if not temporarily, from those they study. Now, clearly there are different kinds of intoxication, some good, some not so good, and some that are fascistic. Concepts of intoxication have run alongside the history of the avant-garde, like an alternative subversive track. Baudelaire's feverish engagement with barricade fighting in 1848, and this is a photograph of barricades set up at either end of the street that would have been defended by intellectuals like Baudelaire as well as working people against national forces. There's a subsequent photograph that shows that the troops moved in having destroyed the barricades. So he was involved in barricade fighting both in March, when it was more of a kind of joyous celebration of resistance, but much more dangerously in June as well, when many of the barricade fighters were being killed. And it led to him shouting for the death of his father-in-law and inviting the National Guard to smell the gunpowder on his fingers, which would result in a likely death sentence if they'd taken up the invitation. He is in tune with the conflicting plights of 19th century Parisians, as if a telegraph wire continually passes messages through his cervical spine. In the poem The Murdered Woman, he writes of the middle-class intoxication with commodities by a detailed description of the room in which the brutal murder has taken place, where the victim's head is placed on the bedside table like a luxurious ornament. In The Ragpicker's Wine, The Lover's Wine, The Murderer's Wine, and other poems, he celebrates the drunks of Paris for succumbing to violence and revolutionary zeal that alcohol stimulates, at the same time that he criticizes hashish as a bourgeois recreation, and therefore useless for revolt. His opinion of the new enthusiasm for photography really sums up this infatuation with commodities. From that moment, he says, our squalid society rushed, Narcissus to a man, to gaze at his trivial image on a scrap of metal. Perhaps his scowl in Carjat's portrait photograph reveals just this thought. Later, he attempts to rescue the artist Marion, whose print I showed you earlier, from poverty and madness by getting the state to buy his work and buying some himself. Baudelaire is one of the first to criticize the vainglorious avant-gardism of his contemporaries, who fuel their artistic intoxication with metaphors drawn from war. And this is very interesting because the term avant-garde itself comes from war, and here Baudelaire is listing all these other, this vocabulary that irritates him because it's been simply pulled from one sector to another thoughtlessly. He writes poems that unmistakably cast his widowed mother as a stoic but emotionally troubled Paris type, and incessantly writes letters to her that express his love, enthuse about his publication prospects, which in reality were next to nothing, while always, without exception, as far as I can see, asking for money. He names his great book of poems The Flowers of Evil, which Benjamin took to reference not just the corrupting impact Paris had on its inhabitants, but also referring to the followers of the most prominent anarchist of the time, Auguste Blanqui. In other words, Baudelaire's engagement with the city and with life is of a radical and critical intoxication that later recurs in different forms with Nietzsche, if you think of the figure, the Dionysian figure about the tragedy, With surrealism, you may remember Breton's Mad Love and the great Paris Peasant by Louis Aragon. Breton wrote, "The derangement of the senses, of all the senses, remains to be achieved," which is from the automatic message. And in a deeply problematic way with Ernst Jünger, whose enthusiasm for his World War I experiences led him to describe war and death as ecstatic experiences on a narcotic level. Quote, "A man in ecstasy becomes a violent storm, a raging sea, roaring thunder, emerges with the cosmos, racing towards death's dark gates like a bullet towards its target." And that's from Junger's book, War's Inner Experience. Let's step back further in history to understand the origins of the avant-garde. In the 1820s, Henri de Saint-Simon issues a call for an artistic avant-garde whose works will publicize the socialist cause in a faster and more efficient way than force of arms. This first linking of artworks to political ends doesn't specify content or medium. On the contrary, Saint-Simon is enthusiastic that poetry, fiction, music, sculpture, and painting can equally well, quote, "spread new ideas amongst men." The oppositional impulse presumed by Saint-Simon proposes a new use value for art that would be an alternative to its allegiances with bourgeois institutions and the enthusiasm for progress that typically accompanied and justified the depredations of the Industrial Revolution. With succeeding avant-gardes, however, we find a bifurcation of antagonistic engagement into, on the one hand, Saint-Simon's aesthetics that engage directly with social issues, and on the other hand, Mallarmé's aesthetics that propose a withdrawal from social usefulness, whether radically disruptive or utilitarian, in favor of what he once termed being on strike against society, as he put it. Baudelaire, as we've seen, moves back and forth across the two lines. This call of Saint-Simon's is contemporaneous with Hegel's statement at the start of his aesthetics about the decline of art's power to represent our ideas, often misinterpreted as signaling the death of art. Imagining there is access through Hegel to understanding the avant-garde seems an unlikely prospect. On the one hand, you have a philosophy of absolutes, whose thinking establishes its final pinnacle of the spirit, also known as the totality of human consciousness, as secure from the impact of temporal conditions. With the avant-garde, on the other hand, you have actions consisting of gestures marked by specificity, temporality, and contingency. Yet Hegel's aesthetics is valuable here because of its timing, where it sits on the brink of the collapse of coherent aesthetic objectives as a comprehensive but doomed attempt to determine the scope of art's meaning and purpose. After this point, art criticism and artist manifestos advocate competing aesthetic agendas and ideologies, a situation that Adorno has to address in his 1968 aesthetic theory to be able to offer an aesthetics relevant to the late 20th century. Before Hegel introduces this notion of decline, there is a kind of exhilaration to his description of art, which he presents as the richest possible experiential field, unlimited in its affirmative revelations. He explains that art is often the only embodiment of the greatest ideas and feelings experienced by an entire nation, that it is the passport to understanding a people's philosophy and religion. How could art do this? By reconnecting conceptual thinking with a sensuous reality from which it had become disconnected, by reintegrating a society, Hegel says, whose ideas have grown alienated from their material origins. Thought might give us some access to the truest reality, but only art can bring this truth into view, where we can fully engage with it. It's reasonable, I think, to recognize in these early remarks a kind of intoxication that Hegel expects to be a part of art making. We are told that art should delight us as a realm of free play, well away from somber introspection, discipline, and conformity. It promises, Hegel says, total and prolonged envelopment in its engagement with every possible facet of actual and imaginative life. It's a shock then to come across Hegel's rebuttal of art's value for his own time. In all these respects, he says, art, considered in its highest vocation, is and remains for us a thing of the past. The reason for this, Hegel says, is that art invites us to intellectual consideration, and that not for the purpose of creating art again, but for knowing philosophically what art is. The realm of free play and rich experience has been superseded by the intellectualization of art's meaning. But Hegel's prescription for art's future development, its redemption, is equally damning. Art must focus on its sensuous properties and not on concepts or worldly affairs. It's at this point that we might recognize an opening for avant-garde aims in rejecting these options and finding new premises for making meaningful work. In spite of the negative relevance of Hegel's aesthetics for the avant-garde, he came closer to understanding a prototypical political and artistic revolutionary in his early phenomenology of the spirit, where in the course of a discussion on alienation, he cannot hide his fascination for the character Jean-François Rameau in Diderot's book Rameau's Nephew from the 1760s. This Rameau is the desperate, alienated, and bohemian nephew of the famous Baroque composer of the same name. In the narrative, he has just been expelled from the salon he frequented for a crude joke that made fun of his patron's power. Dejected and without patronage, he meets Diderot in a Paris cafe, and complaining that all he wants is a good bed, he says, a good bed, good food, warm clothes in winter, cool in summer, plenty of rest, money, and other things that I would rather owe to kindness than earn by toil. Perfect slacker, in other words. Without warning, he begins an extraordinary performance. Diderot writes, he was getting into a passion and beginning to sing, his voice growing louder as his passion increased. He jumbled together 30 different airs, French, Italian, comic, tragic, in every style. Now in a baritone voice he sang to the pit, and straining in falsetto, he tore to shreds the upper notes of some air, imitating the while the stance, walk, and gestures of the several characters. Being in succession furious, mollified, lordly, sneering, he kept on in the grip of mental possession, an enthusiasm so close to madness that it seemed doubtful whether he would recover. This incoherent, not unlike avant-garde's performance, well before any artistic avant-garde exists, is misunderstood by all the spectators, apart from Diderot, who has the nephew explain of his behavior. We need exclamations, interjections, suspensions, interruptions, affirmations, and negations, sounding like a futurist manifesto 150 years later. The nephew performs like a radical artist of a much later era, but he also plots like a later revolutionary. This even precedes the French Revolution by some 20 years. And he greatly disturbs Diderot by telling him of the crimes he's coldly plotting. As Diderot says, in the way a connoisseur in poetry or painting discusses the fine points of the work. So here was a master criminal, terrorist, if you like, revolutionary in the making, which is why this character has been so interesting for later writers, including Hegel and Marx. Hegel thus recognizes in Diderot's dialogue a dance on the brink of revolutionary action, even though he pulls it back into play with the internal dynamics of the progression of abstract thought. This nephew might be described as a transitional figure between the impotence of the flatterer and the impotence of the defeated June 1848 barricade fighter that is Baudelaire himself. He is the ejected hanger-on, now downwardly mobile and nurturing incendiary impulses, still resentful of his unshakable attachment to the bourgeois security of which he once shared a corner. So to bring this talk to a close, let's return to our slacker artists. Acknowledging once again our theme, histories of the contemporary, were there conditions, economic or entropic, that enabled these artists to emerge from obscurity, become briefly visible, to coalesce into a sort of common approach, an uncomfortable zeitgeist grouping perhaps, even if their conflicted engagement was too de-energized to make the most of what they had in common. The term slacker art was coined, as far as I'm aware, by art forum writer Jack Bankowski to echo Richard Linklater's 1991 inaugural film, Slacker, set in Austin, Texas, that tracked the aimless drifting of 20-year-olds across the city. I think there was some relief at finding other life paradigms, however unpromising, in the fallout from the Wall Street crash of October 19, 1987. By the end of that month, share values had fallen between 22% in the US to 60% in New Zealand worldwide. Galleries didn't really admit to an impact on the art market until 1990 or so, and consequently the 1980s came to be characterized throughout as a perfect harmonizing of capital contemporary art objects. Slackerdom appeared antithetical to this knowingly relentless pursuit of success and wealth, and for a moment these artists seemed, by barely doing anything, to have a tolerable approach to continuing to make art. The working method of artists like Katie Nolan, who stopped making work herself in the 90s, Paula Hayes, Laurie Parsons, Karen Kalimnik, involved a collection of ordinary, relatively worthless materials in their informal arrangement in the gallery. There was seldom any manufacturing process, although there was certainly deliberation about setting works in place. References were made, apparently casually, to teenage interests, with Kalimnik here and here, to Rudolf Steiner, with Paula Hayes. Paula Hayes also did an odd sort of withdrawal herself, stopped making this kind of work at a certain point, went into a sort of self-imposed reclusion, and then emerged as a gardener initially, but then turned that gardening interest into new works of art, which she now is quite successful at making these garden installations, both in museums and in people's houses. Laurie Parsons, again, some of her street detritus, or to banal placeholders of American life like beer cans and chain link fencing, with Katie Nolan. The transfer of commodities that characterized late 80s work was nowhere to be seen. I mean, I know there's a beer cans, but it's such a low commodity, a low-level commodity that it stands for other values, or some anti-value reference. The entrancement with commodities is absent from this work. Jessica Diamond, another artist who, again, largely withdrew from the art world, painted large diagrams in black directly on the wall. This is a wall-sized painting. These were visual and verbal non sequiturs, as if she was hardly bothered to figure out if they meant anything or not. One read, "Yes, Bruce Nauman," and another, "Germany is Connecticut," are painted as if by an unskilled hand. Other artists, like Kerry Leibovitz, Sean Landers, and Stephen Perino, are reasonably enough associated with slacker art, and in these cases, welcomed content considered atypical or inappropriate to serious new art at that time. Leibovitz engaged with gay and Jewish identities by way of low-tech fabrication and pathetic humor in effortless, low-value artifacts. In one gallery opening, I remember he sat at a desk baking cookies for the visitors. Landers' first solo show included diaristic logoria on pinned-up sheets of yellow notepad paper. These unrevised streams of adolescent consciousness retrospectively resembling Kurt Cobain's diaries, which was a page from Cobain's diary. Landers, again, confessed to such things as a careless treatment of girlfriends, anxieties over art making and success, ways of conning his parents into sending him more money, and so on. Concerning a life adrift, these were misspelled, compromising reflections of no intrinsic worth, about content of no merit, and yet they felt like they had a finger on an overlooked sensibility, and had the advantage, too, of being very funny. For a show I once curated in New Jersey, Stephen Perino left me with a previously bundled and taped up painting that he had thrown out the night before. He had liked the way it looked in the garbage can when he went to throw out more rubbish in the morning. And this was a shock to be offered this for a show, expecting something else. Could you say of the slackers that they did away with the expensive fabrication and celebrity artist status of the previous decade to clear away for other, more private content that until that point had been forced well below the radar of contemporary art circles? Did they succeed in clearing some space for modest and eccentric content in the wake of a banking crisis. Certainly a small sector of the gallery system, in the way it will always find new markets to open, moved decisively at that point towards such work that was less ostentatious, less professional looking, less obviously worthy of attention. But for me, this doesn't lessen their achievement as artists looking for an artworld boundary of recognizability, where their work might as easily fall off the edge into invisibility as be pulled back into actually meaning something. And that this intersects again with Paul Mann's positionless stupid undergrounds, where recuperability isn't something to be negotiated so much as completely ignored. The term position, inverted commas position, which over the last 20 years has become an indispensable part of the critical lexicon of art education, to indicate a fiercely independent conjunction of concept and practice, probably, as far as I can see, entered our vocabulary when German art dealer Michael Werner used it in a TV program in the 80s called The State of the Art, to qualify the kinds of commercially bankable artists he was prepared to work with. The term then was corrupted from the start. Where these artists we've been looking at configure practices that offer no kind of anti or position that could interest recuperating institutions, practices that are, at least temporarily, beneath merit. This does suggest, if not an exit from the labyrinth, of the historical avant-garde, at least an interruption in the maze before it closes in on us again. Thank you. I imagine there should be a discussion period for questions. I think that's probably what was done before. And I also forgot to introduce myself at the start. Maybe while you're thinking about what you might want to ask or say, I can do that. Mark Harris is an artist and writer and curator. His approaches to making artwork are linked by an interest in the imagery of intoxication as a form of utopian representation, considered as alternative agency to militant strategies of the historical avant-gardes. Primarily working in video, painting, and drawing, he has most recently been reconfiguring photographs derived from hippie communities of the 1960s to consider them as future-oriented wish images. In 2005, he received an Arts Council Fellowship with Long March Project Beijing. Recent exhibitions include State Fair, Wexner Center Columbus, Utopian Bands, Two Collegas Beijing, Western Art Gallery Cincinnati, London Open, Whitechapel Gallery London, 2012, High Times at Welcome Collection, 2011, Baltimore Contemporary, Dana Collect, Soma Arts, San Francisco, 2013. He'll be showing at Delaware Center for Contemporary Arts in March next year. 2009, he received the Warhol Foundation Creative Capital Art Writers Grant. Recent published essays include Hippolyte Risk Music for Houston Contemporary Arts Museum, Chelsea Hotel, March 14, 2008 on Marcia Farquhar's performance work, The City Sings on Heather Phillipson's video work, and Marcia Hafid Glaze paintings. He has contributed an essay to the Countercultural Experiment in Consciousness Encounters at the Edge of Art, published in 2011 by University of Minnesota Press. Do you have some questions, some thoughts or comments that might enlarge on what you're saying? If you've read the Mann section that I put online, perhaps you have some thoughts about that. Yes?
Could you expand more about recuperability? What might we have?
Can I come to that? There's just someone behind you. Is there right? Before we go.
Yeah. I was just thinking, like, when I was reading the text and like looking at these articles like beforehand, it sort of, I don't know, this sort of work and this sort of writing and stuff, it kind of always makes me just think like, okay, like, this is like super cynical, yeah, and this is like super nihilistic, and when this type of work sort of like claims to withdraw, I mean, it's not though, is it? And it's not sort of really talking about any kind of pieces of work that kind of actually try and like, actually sort of fight stuff. And the problem with that is because those sorts of works aren't being seen in galleries and things. They're a lot more kind of like happening within particular like political or sort of specific infrastructures or something like that. So it's just like, I don't know, it's just like, what are you going to do with that? Can't you just like dismiss that cynicism and stuff? And like, I don't really know what my point is other than I think cynicism does come up quite a lot in this, and I don't know. Yeah, it just doesn't. This isn't it. Like this isn't the only option, is it? Like withdrawal.
Oh, no, not at all. It's I think you could have we should have a series of talks, seminar on these alternatives to what seems to be the predominant or expected destinations for art practices, ways of practice. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think then when I came back from New York in '95 to London, having been immersed both in this and in looking at this, not as a participant, but also in the deeply political work that was going on in New York at the time that formed the core of a very important working biennial that Elizabeth Sussman's 1993 biennial, I think, which included artists like Glenn Ligon, Byron Kim, lots of people, Gina Antoni. There were some really interesting initiatives that had been, until that point, underground in the city, much as you described. They had not really been circulating widely, were not widely known. So there were, in a way, these two clear currents, one that was withdrawing and the other that was deeply engaged in explicit political concerns. But to come back to London and find that there were hundreds of galleries run by artists, spaces, initiatives run by artists, that the kind that never existed in New York, that could not exist in New York at that time, was a revelation. And I spent as much time as I could going around these spaces, talking to people, collecting information, documentation, because I saw this as a very, as a crucial initiative, crucial series of initiatives here in London. And some of those were explicitly political. Majority perhaps weren't, but they were a vital alternative to the customary ways of going about becoming a professional artist. And of course, the same in different ways continues now, which I was inviting you really to think about it, as you seem to have done, since you're undoubtedly more engaged with this than I am at the moment. And I tend to, I think I don't agree that this work is cynical. I think there's a play of cynicism with some examples, but I think that that is an aspect of some of the work. But even with that work like Leibowitz or the early Landis work, I think that there's interesting content there that would not be accessible if not for that pose of being outside, of being silent. And at that time, there was really no alternative but to engage in that city, but to engage with the main avenues to business. You couldn't, if you didn't want to engage with galleries, if you didn't want to engage with collectors and curators, you might as well leave the city. There was no, or in the case of some of these artists, stop working altogether. And I think that that's different now, certainly, and it's certainly been different here, I think, since the 90s. And you asked about recuperation. You wanted to.
Yeah, just maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, it's a term in resistance and recuperation in terms of the explanations of the avant-garde. There's been a way that both Berger and Paul Mann have tried to understand the fate of practices that attack or aggressively go against the institution of art, go against or even set themselves up in some ways oppositional in aesthetic terms, not as saying in activist terms. Because I think in terms of the artistic avant-garde, in terms of the avant-garde in the 19th century, you have a political avant-garde and an aesthetic avant-garde. You have artists that are engaged like Baudelaire was in fighting on the barricades, and that has nothing to do with his writing, but it has nothing to do with his work as an artist. And you have him engaged in quite a withdrawn, aestheticized, if you like, approach to poetry. And I think in that period, there are one finds the art in some ways being recuperated, being absorbed, if you like, by the society to which it was opposed. It becomes a way in which that society acclaims and celebrates its own ability to generate interesting, exciting, challenging work, and it does this. It does this in such a way that it appears to send out an avant-garde. It appears to call up an avant-garde, as if to continue to renew its cultural form. In terms of, it's just interesting, I think, in terms of political work at that time, Auguste Blanqui, who I mentioned, who ended his life in prison and was an anarchist communist who Marx and Engels had a certain amount of respect for, but also felt he was not helpful in terms of running these independent anarchist operations that had no interest in some form of organization of workers. They were interested in primarily disruption. And Blanqui himself, at the end of his life, felt that everything he had done had been likewise recuperated, in a sense, or annulled. And he wrote a book called Eternity Through the Stars. That's a very strange vision in which he explains his own failure as an anarchist leader to achieve any change by saying that everything he's done on this world exists in other worlds, that there are thousands, millions of other worlds in which the identical events are happening with identical results. They're happening at different times. And not only are identical things happening, but every possible variation of an action that he might be doing as an anarchist leader is happening in other worlds. And ending in other worlds. There is no, in that sense, there is no improvement, there's no development on this earth nor on the others. And this, I think this is a vision that we're familiar with, I think also from Borges, like with Babel's reiterated in a different form there. In the way that Berger talks about recuperation in relation to the classic avant-garde of Duchamp and Dada, he sees these anti-institutional gestures of Duchamp's, particularly the first one with the armory show, being, of course, accommodated in time by museums and galleries. But with Duchamp, it's complicated, I think, because he also sets up this event to occur. He staged it. He was on the jury that ostensibly rejected the urinal. He was the publisher of the Blind Man Review, which chronicled the scandal such as it was that occurred. So it seems that, in that sense, this was an oppositional gesture that was generated from within the institution that it claimed to be opposed to. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the picture. I just want to ask you a somewhat personal question in relation to this. I mean, this kind of language of making and style and look has come, it's like quite prevalent in the art scene here in London. And I know that like with V22 that happened recently, like a lot of my fellow classmates were incensed by it, like by the slacker kind of aesthetic. So I don't know, I just would find it interesting if you could say from like your point of view, seeing it come back, like seeing it re-emerge, like in its post state, like you have like Duchamp and then in the 90s and then now, like what your feelings are about it. I'd be interested to know.
Yeah. I would still expect to be, I would still want to encounter something I didn't understand initially, at least. That would be my expectation, and I suppose that suggests that I should not be familiar. There should be some unfamiliarity with this thing, so I shouldn't have seen it before. So, I mean, that's a little bit simplistic because certainly one can encounter something one doesn't understand, but it looks exactly like what's previously been, or it's very similar, like with Elaine Sturtevant's work, for example, the replica she still does, or the copies that Shay Levine was making, for example, with Walker Evans photographs. So I don't think it's necessarily a morphological difference that's expected, but something about the encounter I would want to be astonished by, startled by.
So if it's like a kind of like a literal mimesis of some copy of something that you see in, in the 90s, then your response would be like, meh, or I don't know, like you've said your expectations, but I don't know, like I'm just interested.
Yeah, it might be. I would. Yeah, there was something in the BA show last year that I was curious about because I didn't get it, and it looked like a minimal amount of effort had gone into it, but it was somehow curious and it nagged me. So I would have liked to have spoken to the person to find out more about it. So, but I'm not. Yeah, I used to say I've not lately seen so much of this kind of work, but I used to, and I did find myself somewhat judgmental about it. Yes, it seemed there's a situation, and there's always a situation in which these things arise. So, and I might try to retell what the situation is in relation to this work, but not have known it so well at the time. One tries to make sense about something that even made you angry at the time. Certain parts of this work made me very angry at the time, and only acquired depth and meaning later. So I tend to be over tolerant of work that I see, but one does make instant judgments. But I think always it's incumbent on one to find out more about it and to reflect on it. Yes.
Hey, I've got a question about, in some ways about your presentation, but in other ways it's more about reading, writing, talking, and on the other hand, sort of making, art making, object making. So what I wanted to ask really was, I think that like throughout your presentation, in various different ways, we kind of became familiar with different artworks as slacker, as something that could be called slacker art. So I guess what I wanted to ask was, for you, as an artist and a writer, what are these sort of territories, or how do you kind of demarcate these different places? On the one hand, establishing images of things that are interpretable as certain types of things, and on the other hand, perhaps kind of, I guess there's like a traditional difference in some ways between what we might have imagined the artworks kind of being that thing. But I think that maybe I guess what I want to ask about is if you'd also understand the artworks as being involved in that same kind of consciousness, or whether there's a kind of difference. and also in your presentation.
Do you mean, what do you mean by the artworks being involved in that consciousness?
Well, I guess whether you, from experiencing all these artworks, whether you'd always come to them, the audience would always, if the audience would always come to them, understanding them as slacker art, or if they were kind of acts that kind of establish something which has then become known as slacker art.
Yes, I think in the end, yeah, I would. This is the talk. I think, like all writing, to a certain extent, it has a rhetorical element, and in order to convey an argument, if you like, about a bodyword, one falls into one allows it to fall into categories, and this one. This one is the one that I've allowed as slacker for this purpose, and but sure, it's questionable whether the artists themselves were totally content with that designation, certainly, and whether the artwork in question is sufficiently unfolded by this sort of analysis. I would say no. I think it would be. It's important to return to the artworks and the artists to always define it as much as you can, not allow it to be limited by its subsumption under a category like this. And in terms of how I write or how I make work, I think in terms of writing, I began writing because I didn't understand what I was seeing. That was, when I came back from New York in '95. It was a way of trying to understand better what was in front of me, particularly white behavior. And so, yeah, in that sense, it was very much a surrender, in my case, to a situation or a series of objects, rather than bringing prior categories to them. And in terms of the artist writing on categorised, for example, categorised music, in that case, yes, one listens to the music and allows the music to speak, but also, in order to understand it better and also allow it to speak, in my case, I brought to it an understanding or study of the history of avant-garde music, the development of avant-garde music in the 20th century, to try to unlock some of the meaning of this work. But certainly in the Jack Mankowski article, when I reread that, I see that as problematic. It's a piece that sets a certain tone of engagement with a scene, and it brings in artists who I think are not entirely. It oversimplifies the complexity of what's there, and it does it very much on the surface. I would say it's a clever article. There's a lot in it, but it does deal with it very much on the surface, and there are insights there nevertheless. It's worth reading. There's another. Yeah.
I think within slacker art, there's like a problem with like Katie Nolan and Parsons. They're sort of like behind like beer cans or a shoe, and then they're making these arrangements with them that are also very arty. I always see that when you're going around like sort of MA shows, you see this work a lot. And that's I feel like that's a big problem. And it also seems like there are these artists that are making work, but they're not just Katie Nolan, like being an artist, but not wanting to be an artist. That idea, maybe talk about that.
Well, don't you all experience this ambivalence at some time or another in terms of being and to I think in the case of some of these artists, they've made that ambivalence a subject of their work. So, but in the case of some of them, they exit for a number of years or exit completely and come back in. Gretchen Faust is another who left art making. She's currently showing at Greengrassy. She left art making for a number of years. She said to go and read Hegel of all things. So I think there's ambivalence that it is something many of us experience quite routinely. And if we don't, it will, no doubt, be there in the future. In terms of the arrangement of work, I agree. At a certain point, everything looks arranged. Everything acquires form and clarity, particularly through familiarity. And it's an issue, I think, it's an issue particularly, I think, when work enters definitively into a collection, for example, or a museum, not just when it's in a gallery. If anything, in a gallery, it seems to be a temporary staging. But once the work moves on, it either goes back to the studio. In Laurie Parsons' case, a large amount of work and debris that she had installed in the gallery came back and she stored it in the garage. Someone who was checking the garages cleared it all out because he thought it was what it looked like. It was rubbish. So the arrangement and the arrangement or deposit is, I think, inevitably, I think, it requires clarity and form. Of whether whether that's a surrender or a concession, or temporary or permanent, I think it can be all those things.
I'm just thinking of, do you think there's like a relationship between this sniper art of the 90s and post-internet art, for example? Like in a way that's sort of similar in that, post-internet art kind of uses scrap digital visuals to kind of dress down, but I guess maybe without the sort of ambition of trying to leave art behind. Maybe it's doing the reverse. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know much about post-internet. I don't know what examples you might be thinking of. I'm aware of what you're referring to.
Like sort of GIF production of like sort of purposefully.
I suppose in perhaps a certain. So one would have to know something about the distribution, the means of distribution, how it was being circulated. What kind of intent lay behind its wishing to arrive at a destination, a particular destination, whether it was simply to be allowed to float free, anonymously even. I think that would be important for me to know. And I mean, yes, I think it's plausible. You would have, I think you discern something, and perhaps you should tell me.
Yeah, I can't really do any. I don't really know any good examples of which so.
I was curious about this idea of resistance and recuperation you talked about in terms of the avant-garde. How you see that in contemporary terms or going forward, when you've got practices like undetectable creation, for example, that somewhat invert that to occupy a position which inhabits neoliberal attitudes and behaviours, and maybe only confuses that through kind of identity, own identity. I kind of wonder if that's like a contemporary avant-garde, which one could maybe look at it as, if, I don't know, maybe it's a nihilistic sort of proposition, but it's a kind of contemporary one that we have to deal with.
I think because of the I do feel sometimes because of the problems that have beset the avant-garde as it's been classified. Even in the early 19th century, I should say, artists were very reluctant to be classified as avant-garde or to be associated with avant-garde. They felt this was the most superficial of classifications, that it was just a sort of fashionable assignation. So it only really takes hold, I think, of aesthetic, of artistic communities in the late 19th century. So I've tended sometimes to think that it never existed. In the form in which we tend to understand it now, both as an attack on the institution of art, as Berger expresses his interest with Dada, or in terms of the neo-avant-garde, which interests Foster, because one sees recuperation at every level. So then it seems to replay as a trope in some way. And it's a trope in which many artists get involved, in which we continue to believe in. It seems as if there seems to be some need to have this there, even as we accept that it either never existed or was always a failure. So for the sake of this talk, I've assumed that it existed, or that there's some purpose in allowing it to exist. Bernadette Corporation and John Kelsey. John Kelsey I find very interesting as a writer. And of course they run Arena Spalding's in New York, and so there is clearly a clever series of strategies in which they've engaged to find entry points into the art world, simultaneous exit points. And but I was not impressed by the ICA show, and I guess I've been more interested sometimes in what I've seen of Arena Spalding's, Kelsey's writings. As a footnote to that, I know, I can't remember her name, the woman who works as Kelsey's partner in the gallery, but she's a famous, she's a very good singer. And a collector I know who's involved with these people in various ways. Arranged an event for her to perform in a Harlem club that was being closed down. So she, it was like a conventional singing performance. As her as an artist, as performer, as her from Arena Spalding's, as her from Corporation and so on. So all of this was one complicated entity, but certainly on the night it appears to have been primarily a concert, but a concert that would not have been as interesting or effective had she come from that background as an artist. So in some way, does this also become classified as an art event? Does the art become invisible in the process or become accentuated through it? I'm not sure. I'm not even sure from my perspective how interesting a discussion I find this, because I find them clever and successful at working within this larger institution. I'm not sure what comes out of it at the other end. I'm traditional in that respect. I would like there to be some object in the form of a text or an entity that continues to fascinate me and engage me.
I think in a way that's my point, is that it kind of creates a cul-de-sac of sorts within a discourse of institutional critique or something. And if we are to, I'm particularly found this term avant-garde, but if we are to inhabit it for the purposes of talking, then it seems to me that their practice inhabits that space of the avant-garde potentially, in that it's quite disruptive practice. And I just wondered if that kind of cul-de-sac is, I just wonder what your thoughts were on it in relation to that having, because it's something else that came out of this scene in New York around the same time.
A little later.
Yeah.
Well, there were incidents in this time. American Fine Arts, where some of these cyber artists were showing. Colin DeMann was the only one who really was interested in these people. Invented an artist at one stage. And this was an artist called Dog, I think, and made sculptures out of kind of car